Good afternoon and good morning, depending on where you are, and welcome to the season finale of Turnkey Talks. My name is Kelly Lewis, and I serve as the Director of Diversity and Inclusion at TurnkeyZRG. Before we jump into our conversation today, I want to first acknowledge our newest members and organizations who've joined within the last month. Thank you and welcome to the Assembly. I also want to give our founding members a special shout out for joining in the first month in the Dallas Mavericks for the seeding funding to get the Assembly launched. And for those of you who've not joined just yet, we invite you to get involved. So what is the Assembly? It is the first and only member-led organization for people who work in professional sports at teams, leagues, and unions. And our purpose is simple. We exist to champion the advancement of diverse and inclusive leadership, which directly ties into our next session discussion, which I'm super excited about, by the way. At the top of most organizations' marketing heap, one will find a chief marketing officer, tasked with maintaining the innovative vision and executable strategy for one's company's marketing plan. Over the years, we have seen the CMO role morph from simply raising awareness to increasing the bottom line of businesses in an omni-fashion approach. It comes to no surprise that the chief marketing officer tenure in 2020 dropped to 40 months, the lowest it's been since 2009. As with any C-suite role, climbing to the ranks of CMO is challenging, especially for underrepresented groups. And in this case, I'm specifically addressing people of color. Research shows that from the 100 of the most advertised US brand in 2020, almost half of all CMOs in the study were women. While racial and ethnic diversity dropped from 19 to 12% in 1 year amongst incoming CMOs, and a decrease to 13% for all CMOs. In celebration of Asian American Pacific Islander Month, we want to bring attention to one of our Asian American trailblazers within the world of sport. Utilizing the 2019 Tides report, there are only 6 self-identified Asian American C-suite representatives in the NFL. Our next speaker, Alex Chang, has utilized his breadth of experience to climb to the ranks as CMO for the San Francisco 49ers and continues to champion racial equity in sports. Today, you will learn more about his journey, understand the challenges and opportunities as being a person of color and the responsibility that comes with that as being a C-suite member, and best practices in using marketing to impact the bottom line. Before I turn it over to our moderator, Lynn, we invite your questions. Please submit in the Q&A or chat feature at the bottom of your screen. To make sure that the chat is working, please go there now and tell us where you're viewing from and what organization you represent. And with that, Lynn, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Kelly. Appreciate it. Hi, everybody. Thanks for being with us. I'm Len Perna. I'm the Chairman and CEO of TurnkeyZRG, which is an executive recruiting firm in sports entertainment and media for the last 25 years. Super honored to be here with Alex Chang, who we're going to spend the first half hour kind of talking about the arc of his career. But I could say just at the outset that we've been doing search for 25 years, and the placement of Alex at the 49ers is one of our proudest moments at Turnkey. He's truly a very, very special person in CMO. Alex, welcome. Glad to have you.
Hey, thanks, Len. Thank you for saying that. It's really nice of you.
Well, it's really true. And, you know, you've done a great job at the 49ers. And so we'll get to the 49ers closer to the end. Let's just talk about where it begins. You know, there's a lot of folks wondering, how does one get to be the CMO of the 49ers? And so I think the thing we can take away from this is you have to have a degree in biology and public health in order to get on that track. You have those degrees. Talk to us about that. Biology, public health.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think my path definitely isn't the typical path to be a CMO or to be in sports marketing, but I think there are lessons along the way. So I'll kind of just recap my journey. So I grew up son of a doctor. I'm first generation Asian American. My parents are immigrants. And like a lot of Asian American families, the expectation is, well, you're going to be a doctor or engineer, right? Like the one or the other, maybe lawyer, counter, business maybe falls in there, but the doctor is kind of like the thing, especially if your parent's a doctor. And so that was sort of the predetermined path for me, with not really much debate or discussion. Well, it turns out when I went to college, I went to Emory in Atlanta, went to college and right away realized that it really wasn't for me. I didn't really understand things like organic chemistry. I was grossed out by things like biology. And it didn't interest me, didn't get me excited. But what I did was I sort of just kept my mouth shut and kind of put my head down and worked through it for 2 or 3 years, realizing that like, this isn't for me, but what choice do I have, right? By the time I got to my senior year, I got to a point where I was like, this really is like the wrong decision for me. So what are my options at this point? I've committed 3 years to this. What else can I do? And I happen to have some friends who had gone to the School of Public Health at Emory, which is one of the best schools of public health in the country. And they had a health policy and management concentration, which essentially is the business side of healthcare. And I said, well, okay, that's a little bit more interesting to me, understanding business side of it. So let me pivot to that. It's sort of tangential to being a doctor. Maybe it'll be good enough, for my parents to say that'll work for us. So that's what I did. I went to the School of Public Health, ended up focusing on health policy and management. And out of that, I ended up being a strategy consultant for Ernst & Young, which was one of the big 5 consulting companies at that time. And so I did that for a few years, and it was interesting in terms of being able to work with different clients, learn about, different parts of the industry, whether it be insurance companies or healthcare systems. And at the tail end of that was really the start of the first .com boom. This was around the late 90s, 2000. And all the companies, including Ernst & Young, were creating these internet e-commerce focused practices to try to get into the space and help companies grow in that space. And so I joined that practice, and that was really my first introduction into the digital world, back when the internet truly was the wild, wild west. We're talking about, you remember this, Len, sort of, carpet bomb AOL CDs in your mailbox and, dial up and, getting on to net zero free, 60 minutes of internet, to see what you could find. So early days, but it was really interesting to me to be in that space. And I felt
one of the lines on your resume, Alex, actually says that you helped implement an enterprise-wide strategy at American Express for the internet. That's an amazing thing.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. So, that was my pivot, so I said, okay, this consulting thing is interesting, but I really like this digital space. And truthfully, consulting, being on the road, 5 days a week was sort of exhausting. So I said, let me see if I can forge a career in this internet thing and see if there's something there. And so I ended up getting a job at American Express, and what was back then a really sort of this startup, sort of, very grassroots organization in the company to figure out interactive strategy. And back then, no one really knew what to make of it. They just knew it was interesting and there's maybe some opportunity there. So let's suss it out. So that was my first job at Amex, working in this interactive strategy group. And you're right, we had to figure out, what do we do with this from a consumer perspective, from an internal perspective? What are the opportunities? Should we be a portal? If you remember My Yahoo, do you want to be somewhere that people go every day and customized? Is it something people just use for transactions? Do you want to be online brokerage, et cetera? So that was really interesting to kind of learn about that space. I did that job for a few years and, really fell in love with the company. American Express to me was, one of the most amazing companies to work for, not just because of the brand and what they represented, it was because of the culture and the people. At the time, Ken Chenault was the CEO. He was CEO for many years, but he was the CEO, and a guy named John Hayes was the CMO. And these were two of the most, I would say, impactful leaders that I've ever worked for. And it was a combination of both sort of their business acumen, but more importantly, their empathy and their ability to lead people with that empathy. And so I knew I wanted to stay at American Express, want to continue to grow there. And it was also one of these companies where they encourage people to move around internally. And so the way they retain people was to say, we're going to give you opportunities to move around the organization, to learn different parts of the business as you advance. And so you don't have to sacrifice one for the other. You can move around as you move up, which is amazing. Not a lot of companies can do that. And so I ended up moving around the organization. At the end of it, I had 6 different jobs in 4 completely different divisions over the course of 13 years. And so my last job there was vice president of sports and entertainment marketing. And that's where I really got first exposed to our industry. And so I managed their partnerships. On the sports side, there was a heavy NBA focus, golf and tennis, a lot of venue partnerships as well. And entertainment, Live Nation, AEG were partners. And I will tell you, as a marketer, having worked on more traditional product marketing prior to that, and then shifting into sports and entertainment focus, it was like an awakening. Because as a marketer, you're always trying to figure out how to develop a close relationship with the consumer. And when you market products, including brands as prestigious as American Express and products as important as a credit card, you can now only get so far with that relationship. And when you move to sports and entertainment, you automatically get just a little bit closer because the subject matter you're working off of is something they're already passionate about. And that to me was this sort of, awakening and light bulb going off saying, you know what, I love marketing, but I really love sports entertainment marketing because of that additional layer of depth that you can get with the consumer. And so at that point, I really decided I was going to commit my career to being in this space.
I mean, one of the things that's on your resume from back then was incremental 3 billion impressions that you were able to create by using the IP of sports, connecting it and co-branding it with American Express. I mean, that's kind of says it all about just the engagement level and the loyalty towards sports and being able to leverage that for your brand. I mean, It seems like that's the point in your career, and that was 2011. So that's 10 years ago that you got in sports, and you've pretty much been in sports ever since in one way or another.
Correct. That's right. Yeah. I mean, to me, I think it was a great introduction to the industry and also a great learning ground because I was able to see many parts of the industry, right? I sat on the brand side, but I work with properties, I work with media companies, and I was able to see the synergy. And this was a foundation that was set well before I set into that role. This synergy between a brand like Amex and things like the US Open, right? Tennis or golf for that matter. But you think about US Open tennis in Flushing, it's probably one of my favorite live sporting events. The natural synergy between that event, what they stand for, right? The experience they want to provide to their fans and what American Express stood for and the experience they want to provide to their card members was completely synergistic. And you can see why that's a decades-long partnership that's evolved and transformed over time, but at its core, they are fundamentally the same in terms of the values that they share. And so I think that to me was really interesting to see how those marriages come together. It isn't just about signing a big check and figuring out, where we can slap a logo. It's about finding that synergy. And so I really fell in love with the space. But I also realized then after, 13 years in the same company, I was in my mid 30s at that point, I knew it was time to make a change. And it wasn't anything against American Express. As I said, I love that organization, love the culture, love the people, love the leadership. But I felt like, you know what, if I stayed there any longer, I was going to be a lifer. And truth be told, if I wanted to be in this industry, there was really only one job left, right? My boss's job, a guy named Rich Lairfeld, an amazing guy.
Yeah, you know him. Yeah.
Oh, Rich, yeah. And so, at that point, like Rich probably isn't going to go anywhere. He has since moved on, but at that point, Rich wasn't going to go anywhere for a while. I knew that. And I also knew that for me, if I want to continue to learn and grow, it was time to get outside the walls of American Express and to do something different. And so I explored different options at that point. I spent a good 30 or 60 days just meeting with people in the industry, and understanding what's it like to be on the agency side, what's it like to be on property side, media side, et cetera, and just get different perspectives, without any real intention of knowing where I wanted to go. It was just learning at that point and seeing where opportunities might surface. And so from that, I ended up going agency side. I went to IMG College and spent a little bit of time there on the national sales team. From there, I went to Wasserman, who I was already very close with. Wasserman was the agency of record for American Express, so I knew the leadership there very well. And so I ended up joining their consulting division. I worked on brands like Verizon and Microsoft, helping them manage their partnerships. And while at Wasserman, they ended up taking on Samsung as a client. And at the time, Samsung was building out a new marketing organization for the US in New York, and they needed help. And so the CMO there, a guy named Mark McHugh, asked Casey Wasserman, like, hey, I need someone to help manage our sports partnerships. We've got this massive NBA deal that's up for renewal. We've got the Olympics coming up in Rio. And I don't really have anyone who knows how to work on these properties very well. Our focus traditionally has been more on the media side, but we don't really have someone who understands sports properties. Do you know anyone? And so Casey offered me up as someone who could help them out. I ended up embedding there for 6 months. And at the end of the 6 months, we kind of had to sit down, all of us, and said, okay, what do you think? And Mark said, we'd love to have you come on and join us full time. And so I did that for a few years and worked on some amazing properties, including the Olympics, as I said, and really got that international experience. But lo and behold, 2.5 years ago now, I get an email from your team with an opportunity. And truth be told, like I've always been on your guys' kind of database. You guys have reached out to me in the past with different opportunities, and nothing has quite been the right fit, either based on geography or role or whatever, timing, whatever it was. But this one intrigued me, and I'll tell you why. I think number one, it was from the 49ers. And when we think about brands in sports, there are, brands like the Yankees and Manchester United and Dallas Cowboys and the 49ers. It's just one of the most respected brands in sports. It represents success, all of those things that you really strive for. So that intrigued me. Number two, the job description itself. it read like a true CMO job. And when I say that, I would say that I was sort of, I was biased in a way that I felt like CMO jobs at teams weren't true marketing jobs. In my mind, and again, this is probably not a accurate perception, but in my mind, it was sort of like, if you're a CMO or a marketer on a team side, it's probably a lot of brand police, right? A lot of logo police and just doing like partner activations, but you're probably not doing like real marketing, meaning you're not looking at strategic approaches to market and growing fan bases and transforming, channel strategies and things like that. This had all of that in there. And basically what it said was, we need someone to come in and reinvent from top to bottom how we approach marketing and branding. Not just strategy, but implementation, staffing, resources, the whole thing.
It's funny, for a long time in sports, it was sort of run by salespeople who I think honestly didn't respect the marketing skill set like it is respected now. And what they came to understand is a brand like the 49ers are only as good and valuable as how they are positioned in the marketplace and how they're marketed. And so everybody's had that epiphany now, but back then, I think the 49ers were the first to really understand the value of what you could bring to the table.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, most NFL teams, most CMOs are like me, the first one in the organization, meaning prior to that, like you said, marketing wasn't seen as worthy enough to have a C-level title. It was usually a VP of marketing. It, like you said, may sit under sales or in conjunction with sales. But I think the realization is really something that we're seeing across all sports, which is, in order to continue to build our brands and our businesses for the future, we've got to get serious about marketing and branding, because the reality is we can't just sit back and assume we're going to grow fan bases just by being here. 20 plus years ago, 30 years ago, when I was a kid growing up, sure, if you're an NFL team, you're going to get fans because you're the only game in town. You are what people talk about. You're what people kind of spend their free time on. You're what people spend discretionary income on. Today, as you know, the options are endless. A zillion content platforms, influencers, games, social media platforms. There's so much out there competing for hearts, minds, and wallets that just being a professional sports team isn't going to be enough. You've got to really think about marketing in a much deeper way. And you have to think about the way that traditional brands think about it, which is why I think you're seeing a lot of people like me who come from outside of kind of the team or property realm move into that space.
One of the other things that makes you unique, Alex, is going way back early days of American Express. You actually were on top of a telesales unit at American Express. So you understood direct marketing, direct response marketing, telemarketing, so that made you uniquely suited to come in as a marketing person to what was a sales organization. You understood sales.
Yeah, absolutely. I like how you position that. It's very positive. It made me feel super outdated because telemarketing is probably a phrase that a lot of modern marketers don't know what that is. Like, what's that? But yeah, I think understanding the operational side of selling, both sort of direct selling, hand-to-hand combat, literally on the phones, talking to customers directly, or doing a more mass approach, is important. I think also something that I brought to the table was I was on the buy side from a brand standpoint, both sitting in a brand at Samsung and American Express, and also on the advisory side, sitting at the agency. And so understanding how to work with our partnerships team and understanding the relationship they have with their partners and understand the point of view the partners have, having sat in their seats, was a kind of additional layer, I think, of benefit that I could bring to the organization.
So you come to the 49ers almost like a Swiss Army knife because you have touched so many different pieces. You've been on the brand side, the agency side, now you're on the property side. You understood sales, you understood all of the different pieces of communications, PR. Tell us about your job at the 49ers now. What are the things that are, challenging to you? What are the things that are inspiring to you? What are the things that you're trying to make happen now for the 49ers?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the job is truthfully everything I expected and more. And what I mean by this, I think the breadth of the role and the trust that's been given to me and my organization is so broad and so far reaching that I couldn't ask for more. And so it's everything from top to bottom. It's brand strategy, communication strategy, channel strategy. It's about how we manage our social and digital platforms, our content strategy, design strategy. It even goes down to things that I truthfully knew nothing about, like game day presentation, right? Like I didn't even like I saw that on the description and I had a sense of like, okay, it probably means like things that happen on game day. I didn't realize the depth.
So
Like,
talk to us about that. Like, are you actually approving the playlist? Are you approving the video list? Are you on the headset? Are you calling the game, or does that person report to you? What's your involvement in that?
yeah, so I have a team that does that. That's definitely not me. I'm definitely not producing the game. I would not be on that headset. I would not do well in that situation. But yes, like that is part of my team. I have a team of producers who have been doing it for years, who really understand on operationally how that works. There's a lot of input that I have in that process, though, because a lot of it is how the brand's represented, right? Thinking about how we look at things like entertainment, playlists, cheerleaders, mascots, pregame, halftime, all of those things are part of the way that people experience our brand live. And so to me, that's really important that we get that right. But
I mean, here's a curveball for you, and this is a little bit out of left field. We didn't think we were going to talk about this, but some of the other teams have had issues with cheerleaders and things like that. And so, and it's a different world now. And we're so kind of as a segue, I mean, how do you look at that part of the show? What you're thinking about that? How is it changing? Where do you think it's headed? Where might it be 5 years from now from where it was, way back when cheerleaders, first appeared on sidelines?
Yeah, for sure. We spent a lot of time on that, to be honest with you, because I think it's really important that you update and sort of bring into modern times what the concept of cheerleading really is. And I think what we're doing now, and you'll see some significant changes as we go into this season, you're going to see changes where you really transition it from being kind of what before was maybe just objectifying women, frankly, to something where you're actually celebrating their athleticism and their skill. And so you're going to see, I think, more of a transition from what you think of sort of old-fashioned cheerleaders into more of dance teams, hype team type roles, and both in terms of appearance, but also in terms of the performance.
Awesome. And then, people are consuming the 49ers in so many different ways. And what is the philosophy now in terms of giving them the content that they're looking for, that they want, where they want it, when they want it, how they want it? Talk about that, because you've got such a huge audience on all these different platforms. Like, how are you leveraging these platforms, and how are you making sure that people can consume the content they want?
Yeah, for sure. I think this is probably one of the biggest sea changes that you're seeing in sports, right? Sports as an industry and teams specifically, we're sort of predicated on this model of the live game and the live game broadcast being the core product, right? And really the only thing, and everything else was sort of filler or an afterthought. And in today's day and age, that's just not the case anymore, right? Of course, games are important. Live games are really important. But the reality is that when you have fans engaging with you, they're engaging 24/7, 365, especially in a sport like ours, where there really is no off season. I mean, you saw how much hype, especially our team this year had leading up to the draft. You're talking about months of speculation and endless debate about, the draft. And then you get into the schedule.
A lot of which fueled by you guys, by the way. Like that's, that's like, you guys were very coy. You kept the cards close to the chest. I loved it.
We didn't do anything. I think we just went about our business. I think it was the media and the fans and everyone around us who was kind of creating all of this conversation, again, which is great. That's awesome. But the reality is, like, we didn't fuel any of that. We just sat back and did our jobs, and our team did their jobs. But the point is that level of interest and engagement is so strong year round that if you're just relying on in-season live game, once a week to be your thing that you're using to engage your fans, you're missing out on opportunities. And so we fully recognize that. And so what that means is that you have to be always on. You've got to think about content from a mobile first, social first strategy, which again is a sea change from the traditional NFL films and long documentary style stuff. Like, that's still great, but today's day and age, you've got to be faster. You've got to be more responsive. You've got to be everywhere. There's also thinking about expanding geographically who you're targeting, right? So from an audience standpoint, a lot of teams had focused on butts in seats, right? How do we sell out our building? In our case, how do we get 70,000 people into our building? And that's who we're focused on. And again, super important audience for us because they do drive direct revenue for our business. And they're our most engaged fans. But the reality is we have tens of millions of fans who will never set foot in this building, but they're what build the value of the 49ers in totality. It's all of that. right? That creates the value of the 49ers and the strength of our brand. And so widen the aperture to say, let's think about people outside of 70,000 people who come to our building, even outside of our DMA, because we have fans all over the country and all over the world. Broadening that perspective of who we're targeting from a marketing standpoint has been really important as well.
I know that you are also, and when I say you, the 49ers are a leader in using data, data analytics, business intelligence, understanding customers, prospective customers. Can you talk a little bit about that department, how it's set up? What kinds of information are you looking for? What insights can you get? Any aha moments, where you've looked at a data set and said, wow, there's an opportunity for us?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, we have an incredible business strategy and analytics team led by a gentleman named Moon Javed. So Moon is incredible in this space. Moon, he's well known in the industry. He's got a great team that supports him as well. And for me, first and foremost, an organization like ours committing resources for that discipline in the way that we have is really important, because it shows that they recognize the importance of data and analytics in all of our businesses, right? Not just from marketing, but from a sales standpoint, from a stadium operations standpoint, et cetera. And so with Moon's team, we really work hand in glove to understand what are the key issues that we're facing, what are questions that we have, and what information can we get through research, primary, secondary, et cetera, to help answer those questions. Now, the reality is data is interesting, because I think a lot of times people tend to look at data the way they want to see it, right? They're looking for a certain answer to the question they have, and they're hoping the data kind of validates that answer that they're looking for. And that won't always be the case. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't support. In some cases, you may see data, but you feel like, it doesn't kind of mesh with what my gut tells me we need to do. And so you have to adjust based on that. And so I think our approach here is quite balanced, meaning we always take data into consideration, but we're not always going to say, let's just do it because the data says we do it, right? I always think back to that Office. I love The Office. That Office episode where like Michael's using the GPS with Dwight and they're navigating, and the GPS is telling him to turn like right into the lake. And Dwight's like, stop. And Mike's like, no, it says go right. I'm going right. And they like drive the rental car into the lake. Like sometimes you have to say, like this doesn't quite make sense. But I do think it's really critical for all brands, including teams, to commit to the time, energy, and the resources to analytics. Because going forward, that won't be a luxury when it comes to marketing and brand building. It's going to be super critical.
And of course, you can, there are clubs that outsource some of these things, but that seems like a core skill set now that you need in-house. Those are muscles you need to flex every single day in order to be good at those things. And it's all about measurement. And so the next question is really about how you measure your own performance. And because it's with salespeople, you can sort of measure them by the points they're putting on the scoreboard. How are you, or let's say you and Al Guido, looking at you at the end of the year and measuring how you did in a given year?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of facets to that, right? So from a pure marketing and branding standpoint, it's about, are we growing our reach and are we deepening our engagement, right? And so that's really understanding through things like our social channels, through our content. Are we really addressing our audience and are we growing our audience? Today, the biggest challenge I said before, for all brands, including teams, is growing your audience base, right? Especially younger fans, right? People my kids' age. I have 3 kids, all under the age of 11, and they love sports, and partly because I'm in an industry and I expose them to sports all the time, but they also have a lot of other interests outside of that. And that's the case of every household that's out there. And so really understanding, are we growing our reach with target audiences, such as Gen Z or Gen Alpha, multicultural audiences, international audiences, is really important. Engagement is all about kind of how deep is that relationship? How many touch points are we creating and how engaged are they, right? Is it really light or is it deep? Are we seeing engagement through our content, through retail, through ticketing and other ways? Or are we just seeing light touches? And understanding how that breaks out amongst different audiences is critical. And then there's a component in terms of supporting sales, right? I work really closely with Brent Shobe, our CRO. He's a good friend of mine. We get along really well and our teams get along really well. And a big part of what my team does is help support his team and making sure they're successful. And so making sure that we're out there working with them from ideation to relationship management to activation of partnerships is a big part of my team's role and a big part of how we measure success.
So let's kind of pivot now and talk a little bit about, I think, something that is a little bit sad, which is some of the violence that's recently come around towards Asian Americans. And, you know, I guess just, you know, talk from the heart a little bit about when you hear stories like that and you see things like that on the news, how does that impact you? How does it hit on your shoulders? And how do you carry that? And then let's talk about, you know, what people can do to combat that.
Yeah. No, thank you for bringing that up. It's a big deal for me. It's obviously very personal. I'm someone, just as a, you know, as backstory, I grew up in North Carolina in a really small town, north of Charlotte. And so basically like I wouldn't even call it a suburb. It was really like a small town. All right. And so the town I grew up in had really very little diversity. It was probably 80% white, 19.999% African-American, and 0.0001% other. And my family was the other. Literally, that was it. It was us. Okay. And so for me, I think growing up in that environment, which I will say was, you know, was bigoted for sure. It was something that, you know, affected me from a very early age, and probably what drove me to move as quickly as I could out of that environment. So I went to college and grad school in Atlanta. I ended up then moving to New York, living in New York for 20 years. And now I'm here in the Bay Area. And I think it's a very concerted effort to think about where I am for myself as well as for my family in terms of making sure that we're in an area that's diverse, right, and accepting of all people. So when you see what's been going on over the past year plus with the API community and the hate and the violence that's been directed towards our community, it's frustrating. It's infuriating in a lot of ways, and it's happening everywhere. It's happening here in the Bay Area, right? It's happening in New York, right? It's happening in places all over the country, including places that you would think would be more progressive and more diverse. There are a lot of underlying issues, Len, that go on there, right? At a surface level, we know what's driving it, right? It was all the rhetoric coming out about Kung flu and China virus and all of that, and scapegoating the Asian American community that sort of drove it. But there were underlying issues there, right? There's a perception that Asian Americans are what's called the model minority, and it's some of the model minority myth. You may have heard that before, but it's this myth that the Asian Americans are well-to-do, all well-to-do. They're all advantaged in a certain way over other minorities, and they don't struggle at all, and they don't experience any of the issues that other minority groups may face. And all that is false. All those things are false. So when you kind of combine this rhetoric that came out of the pandemic with this underlying, you know, model minority myth and sort of natural tension between the Asian community and other groups, including other minority groups, it culminates in what you're seeing now, which is a lot of hate and a lot of violence. There's also the issue over time where our community has been known to keep quiet, right? Keep their head down. I talked about my own experience, right? Being in college and being pre-med and just keep my head down and just do the work and don't really complain about it. That's kind of a generalization of our community in general, that people just tend to keep their own business, you know, just keep your head down, do what you got to do. Don't say anything, don't speak up, right? And that's something that I think people are tired of. You know, our community is tired of doing that. We're tired of just being quiet and being the kind of obedient.
Why is that? Is that a cultural thing? I mean, where does that come from, do you think?
It's cultural in some ways. I think also for Asian Americans specifically, it's about survival and assimilation, right? So when my parents immigrated here in the 70s, you know, my dad's a doctor coming from Taiwan. For him to be successful and to get patients, he has to assimilate, right? We moved to North Carolina in that little town because they only had one other OB/GYN. They needed another doctor. They had one other OB/GYN for the entire town. They needed a second one, right? And so it's not like that's the first place you'd want to move to this little town in North Carolina, but they had a need. And for him as an immigrant, right, coming in, a foreigner as a doctor, like his options were limited, right? But when we moved to that town, one of the first things that we did, I remember this as a kid growing up there, one of the first things is we joined a church, right? A Presbyterian church. Okay. And in that town, everyone is a member of some church, Presbyterian, Lutheran, Methodist, whatever, but you go to church on Sundays, right? You go to Sunday school and all of that stuff. Guess what? My parents were Buddhists, right? And so we go to church because it's part of assimilating. And I think that's just an example of what you have to do, you know, as a immigrant trying to make it in this country. And a lot of times that sort of need to assimilate or necessity to assimilate then turns into this sort of obedience in some ways, and sort of just, like I said, keeping your head down and minding your own business, and I think it's gotten to a point where when you start to look at people like myself, a first generation or second generation now, who've now grown up here and started to like understand kind of our role in this society, it doesn't work for us. And so that's why you're seeing more people speaking out now, and rightfully so, about what's been going on over the past year. Had this happened 20, 30 years ago, you might not see, the movement that you're seeing now. Now, obviously being the social media age, the multimedia age helps it as well. But I think a lot of it is driven by people, from my generation and younger, who are willing to speak up and to stand up.
And so thinking about the Pro Sports Assembly and what our mission is here, you are on the board, I am on the advisory board, and what can we do in pro sports when just thinking about maybe within this organization, Pro Sports Assembly, and even beyond Pro Sports Assembly, what are the things that all of us should be doing in order to combat some of these things?
Yeah, and I'll kind of broaden the aperture on this, go beyond AAPI hate, but this is about Black Lives Matter. This is about the pandemic. This is about, the political environment and voting. This is about all those things. What we saw in 2020 was, in my mind, the true power of sports, meaning at the end of the day, yes, we're all part of a team or a league or a union, and that's our, kind of core business, but we have the ability to impact so much more. And I've been really encouraged by so many organizations like ours stepping up and saying, you know what, we're going to take a stand and we're going to take action as it relates to things that have nothing to do with our core business, nothing to do with what's happening on the field, right? And so I think, to me, that's what organizations in our industry can do, because we have that ability, we have that impact. People care what the 49ers and our players, our owners, our coaches, our GMs, our presidents, what they have to say. People are listening and they're impacted by it, right? Our league is in the same position. And so not all brands can say that, frankly, right? I think about, Samsung is a very well-known brand. It's one of the most valuable brands in the world. They have budgets that dwarf anything I could ever touch here at the 49ers. But the reality is this: when they speak out on social issues, it's not going to land as impactfully as if we do. And it goes back to what I said at the beginning of this, is because our relationship with the consumer is very different, right? We're tattooed on their arm. We're the flag on their house. We're the bumper sticker on their car. We're the logo on their hat. Like we are part of their identity, not just something that they happen to buy or use. And so because of that relationship, we can make an impact. So to me, I think when you talk about what can sports as an industry do, is continue to stay engaged and stay involved. I think last year you saw a lot of really great examples of that, and I'm hoping we continue to see those going forward. I don't want it to be a situation where people felt like, okay, we have to do it now because everyone else is doing it, and it's kind of like the thing that's dominating the news cycle. But once it's not, we're just going to go back to business as usual. I hope we never go back to business as usual. I hope 2020 is what we do, and not in terms of the situation we're in, because it was horrible situations that led to all those things, but the awakening of sports organizations to say we can express ourselves in ways that are well beyond what we used to do, and address topics that are well beyond what we typically used to talk about. I think that's amazing.
I mean, we do a monthly newsletter, and at one point last year, I had said that I was never more proud than I have been this year of the sports industry, the clubs, the leagues, the athletes themselves, people putting their businesses at risk, their personal brands at risk to stand up for these issues. And it takes a lot of courage. I think most people don't understand the courage it takes to stand on these issues like this. But in sports, now more than ever, I feel like we finally decided to use our platform in a way that can drive change like this. And it's great to be in the sports industry right now, I think.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I agree 100%. It's not always the easy decisions, but it's the right decisions, and you feel good about that, because ultimately there's certain things I talk about, data before and ROI and all of that. Like the data and the research may not support taking certain actions, but your heart does, and you want to be in a situation. I'm lucky enough to be in one of those where our organization allows us to lead with our hearts, and that's something that's to me really powerful, and a reason why I'm so happy here.
I'm going to call Kelly back up, and we've got a little bit of time left for questions. So Kelly, please join us. And if we have questions from the audience, let's hear them.
Thanks, Len. So we do have a couple of questions that came to me directly. For those of you who are in the audience, feel free to send me a direct chat as well. With that being said, what marketing trends do you anticipate to see in the last 6 months of the year, Alex?
I think you're in for this year specifically. I think a lot of what you're going to see is sort of this hybrid approach as we start to move back to quote unquote normal. And what I mean by that is I think last year was a lot of experimentation, especially in the digital social space, because that's the only way that we could engage with consumers and with fans. I think you're going to see a lot of those carry over because things just worked, and people realize that, we can do this all the time and it can kind of expand our reach and impact. But you're also going to have to see this kind of reinvention of what the live experience is like as those start to come back online in meaningful ways. You're starting to see some of that now with teams with limited capacity and some teams even with full capacity. But I think you're going to see kind of this wholesale swing back to kind of what we used to do and getting people back together. And I think hopefully an appreciation of that. I know for me personally, I'm coming back to the office now, and anytime I run into someone here, like it's nice just to see people again. And I know our fans are going to feel the same way when they come back to the building and see their fellow fans who they shared a section with, for years and years, to see them again. So I think, providing the best experience for people as they come back, acknowledging the concerns they have, around their safety and health is going to be really important as well. Making sure we're making those adjustments are going to be important. But, to me, I think that return to, quote unquote, normalcy as we start to kind of finish this calendar year is going to be really important. And again, as we head into 22.
Awesome. And so kind of picking back a little bit on your conversation that you just had with Len as it relates to D&I, someone's curious about how does the company's culture impact its marketing, if at all?
It's a 1000% impacts the marketing. So, I kind of gave the example of the challenge we faced last year, right? And so, when the pandemic struck, when you had the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, when you had, the voting climate and sort of the need to get people to get out and vote. Here in Northern California, you had wildfires that afflicted us for months and months. When you had all these issues kind of facing our community, this organization immediately sprung to action and said, what can we do? Right? Not should we do something, what can we do? And that's part of the culture, right? That's a expectation that's set at the top in terms of the culture of the organization and the role that we see ourselves playing in our community and society as a whole. And so that directly impacts not just my team from a marketing standpoint. We're at kind of one of the ways that you can take action to address those things, but also it's our foundation, it's our community outreach efforts, it's our players, it's our coaches, it's our partnerships team, it's really our stadium operations. Literally everyone is mobilized in that way. A few months ago we opened the largest vaccination site in the state of California, right? And that's not something we needed to do, but something we wanted to do because we knew we had the ability to help, our community. And again, that's something that requires everyone to get involved. Our government affairs folks, stadium operations, my team, PR, we all get involved in that effort. That has nothing to do with football, right? But has everything to do with being a good corporate citizen and being a good, a good neighbor to our Bay Area community.
Thank you. And so this is my own question that's coming in here. And so as you know, I'm a director of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So as we talk about this concept of culture, doing it right, D&I seems to be at the forefront or center of this organization. And so I'm seeing a lot of organizations who are getting into multicultural marketing, and that seems to be their tool to be able to create or connect with the consumer. But as I think about marketing holistically, right, because that's targeting a specific population, would you say that there's a difference between diversity and inclusion centered marketing versus multicultural marketing? And if so, what is that difference?
Yeah, there's definitely a difference. I think, talk about inclusive marketing, it's about representation, right? And to me, that's not just in terms of representation of kind of who's in your marketing materials. It's also about who's on your marketing organization, internally, and what perspectives are you bringing to the table? And are they inclusive in that way? Meaning, are you thinking about kind of a broader audience? Whether it's how you're developing marketing, but also then how it's expressed. And are you thinking about marketing both as a team and as a product in a way that represents your community, right? Like we're blessed to have one of the most diverse fan bases in all of sports, and that's a byproduct of the community that we live in. The Bay Area is incredibly diverse, but we have to make sure that our marketing reflects that, right? And that we're speaking to all audiences. From a multicultural standpoint, to me, that's, as you said, something different. That's about targeting. And that's about saying, are we developing specific marketing assets or campaigns for a certain audience, right? And are we tailoring it for them from a language and a culture and a content standpoint? Also very important. So it's not one or the other, I think you have to think about both, but they are different.
Thank you. And so as we wrap up here, we always want to know about the youth. And so what skills do you recommend a young marketer develop in order to climb to the ranks of CMO?
I think it's about finding opportunities to learn and grow and recognizing that your next job probably isn't your last job, right? So unlike when I started my career 20 plus years ago now, people tend to stay in jobs longer, and Len knows this. I'm sure average 10 years, 20 years ago, 30 years ago are much longer than they are today. And so when you made a decision about a role, it was a bit of a commitment in that way. And if you stayed at a job less than, 2 years, people kind of frowned upon that and said you were a job hopper or something must be wrong. I think it's different today. I think there is opportunities for more mobility today. And so as I talk to people about, kind of career opportunities, especially early on in their careers, I always tell people, listen, take some pressure off of this decision. This isn't the last decision you're going to make. It's the next decision. And so think about it in that context and think about what's going to help you learn and grow for this moment. What skill set do you need to add at this moment in your career in order to help you then get to the next thing and the next thing? And, so for me, that's how I approached all the moves I made in my career up to this point, was to say, right now, what is it that gets me excited? What's going to help me learn and grow and continue to challenge me? What's going to give me a different perspective in the thing that I love to do? And you can't go wrong in that way. Now, at some point you land, right? And so for me, being now officially in my mid 40s, having achieved a CMO title, which, from a marketing standpoint is sort of the pinnacle of CMO, being at the 49ers, like I'm in an amazing position at this point. And so like, as you start to kind of find, these roles and you start to advance, it gets harder and harder to find the next thing because your needs become less and less. You start to realize, wow, like I've actually been able to achieve a lot. And so I'm very grateful in that way. But I think when you're younger and you're starting out and you're finding those opportunities, like take them where they come. I know so many people who started in sports just doing ticket sales, right? Or doing game day activation, and just working part-time and just getting their feet in the industry. That's great. I would encourage everyone to do that, because you have to start somewhere, and you start to learn, you grow, and you build relationships. And as you all know, relationships are a huge part of our industry. It's a really small industry when it comes at the end of the day, even though it's a multi-billion-dollar industry. In terms of people standpoint, everyone kind of knows everyone. And so building those relationships early, however you can, is going to be a really key part of being successful.
Awesome. So I take it back. I do have one more question. And so how have you been keeping yourself whole? What are you doing to ensure that you're the best you showing up to work every day?
Yeah, and for me, it's been a lot about silver linings, and trying to figure out how do you find the positives out of what's going on. I think we talked about already, from a work standpoint, being able to really expand what we do to address societal issues was a silver lining of all the tragedy that we've all experienced over the past year plus. I think from a personal standpoint, being able to spend more time with my family, especially that we're all kind of new to this area. We just moved here 2 years ago. And so being able to spend more time with my kids and my wife and being able to kind of, spend that quality time together over the past year has been great. And then honestly, for me, getting outside, taking advantage of the fact that I live in Northern California, where it's pretty much like 70 every day and only rains like a month out of the year. Spending time outside, shooting hoops and playing golf and all those things has been really important, just staying active.
I love it. Wellness is also equally as important as everything that we're doing here. Alex, it's been an absolute pleasure chatting with you today. I want to thank you so much for your time and engagement. And for those of you that are in the audience with us, where our content at the moment is currently open access, we will be transitioning much to a member only. And with that, I have a great announcement. On June 29th, Turnkey will be hosting its first member only event, which is centered on recruitment, engagement, and retention of diverse talent. And so our goal here is to empower members of the Pro Sports Assembly engaged with making hiring decisions to be exceptional leaders in the recruitment and attraction of executive level diverse talent.